The countdown was already running before anyone in the Threxian fleet noticed it had started. Nobody would understand that yet. For now, there was only silence. The same silence that had covered a small blue system called Sol for 41 years, 3 months, and 6 days. The Threxian Empire had a name for that silence. They called it weakness. They were wrong, but they would not learn how wrong for a long time. Ambassador Cadet Vesa Ilkorin had been assigned to Sol Watch as a punishment. Everyone told her so, and everyone told her the same joke. Watching Earth was like watching a rock. Nothing ever moved. No fleet drills, no weapons tests, no aggressive expansion into the outer belts that any young, hungry species would have claimed by now. Just faint civilian broadcasts, old and strange, drifting outward into a galaxy that had stopped listening decades ago. Vesa didn't think it was a joke. She thought it was strange. She sat now in the observation deck of the outpost station orbiting the edge of the Kuiper debris field, watching Sol's 9th planet, dwarf, cold, forgotten, turn slowly on the main display. Her superiors called this posting an insult. She had started to suspect it was something else, a blind spot, and blind spots, in her experience, were where the interesting things hid. "You're still reading those old files," said a voice behind her. Rethus, her aide, a heavy-set Threxian with more patience for paperwork than curiosity. "The Marshal's fleet arrives in 6 hours. You should be preparing the welcome protocol, not digging through sealed archives nobody's opened in 40 years. "That's exactly why I'm digging," Vesa said. "Nobody's opened them in 40 years. Doesn't that bother you?" "No," Rethus said. "It bores me." Vesa didn't answer. She was scrolling through a contact log, the very first recorded contact with Earth, filed by a diplomatic envoy whose name had been redacted. Most of the report was standard. Species classification, technological benchmarks, threat assessment rated at the lowest possible tier. But there was a break in the record, a 3-week gap where no updates had been filed. And then, after the gap, one final entry, unsigned, 5 words long. Recommend immediate and permanent silence, not withdrawal, not retreat, not silence. As if the writer had chosen that word on purpose and meant it as a warning rather than a summary. Vesa tried to pull the full report. Access denied. Clearance level exceeded. She tried the envoy's identity. Redacted. She tried the ship registry for the vessel that had filed it. Also redacted, except for one line that hadn't been scrubbed cleanly. A partial name, 3 characters. Cal. The door chimed before she could dig further. Rethus again, this time looking uneasy. "The Marshal wants you on the bridge. Now." High Marshal Thranak Dull did not stand for people. He made people stand for him, and he liked to make them wait while he finished whatever he was doing. In this case, reviewing the annexation plan for Sol's outer resource belts on a floating display that filled half the command deck. He was broad even for a Threxian, scarred across one cheek from a campaign 40 years gone, and utterly, comfortably certain of everything he was about to do. "Cadet Ilkorin," he said, without looking up. "You've spent 3 months staring at a dead system. Tell me something useful." "I don't think it's dead, sir. I think it's waiting." That got his attention. He looked up, unimpressed. "Waiting for what?" "I don't know yet. But the record shows Earth went completely silent 41 years ago. No broadcasts, no expansion, no weapons testing, nothing. Immediately after a first contact incident that was never fully documented. The final line of the report recommends permanent silence. Not from Earth. From us." Thranak laughed, a short, hard sound that echoed off the deck. A frightened diplomat 40 years ago got spooked by a species that hadn't even left its own solar system. That's not a mystery, Cadet. That's a coward's paperwork. "With respect, sir, cowards don't usually get their reports classified above Marshal-level clearance." The laughter stopped. For just a moment, something crossed Thranak's face. Not doubt, not quite, but the flicker of a man recalculating. Then it was gone, buried under decades of certainty. "Clearance restrictions are bureaucracy, not evidence. I've read the actual threat assessments. Earth has no shielded fleet, No coordinated defense grid, no allies in this quadrant. They have opinions and radio static. In 6 hours, we take the outer belts, and if they object, we remind them why the Empire doesn't ask permission. And if they don't object at all, Vesa asked, doesn't that worry you more? Threnak studied her for a long moment. The way a man studies an insect that has, against all odds, said something almost interesting. You have a strange way of seeing weakness, cadet. I don't think it's weakness, sir. I think it's discipline. And I don't understand why a species would need 40 years of discipline unless something taught them they needed it. He turned back to the display, already dismissing her. Prepare the envoy shuttle. We'll be cordial. We'll even let them keep a colony or two on the inner worlds if they behave. Dismissed. Vesa left the bridge with the uneasy feeling of a woman who had asked the right question to the wrong man. She spent the next 5 hours alone in the archive terminal, chasing the 3 broken letters, Cal, through every registry she had access to, and finding nothing. Whatever ship had filed that final report had been erased from the record almost perfectly. Almost. In the corner of one badly compressed data fragment, she found a partial insignia. A jagged circle, half burned away by decades of file corruption. She didn't recognize it. She was fairly sure nobody currently serving in the Empire would. By the time the fleet began its final approach into the Sol system, Vesa had stopped believing this was a routine annexation. She stood at the observation window as the massive Threxian warship slid into formation around a small, blue, unremarkable planet that had gone quiet on purpose and stayed quiet for 41 years, waiting for something. Threnek's voice came over the fleet channel, calm and satisfied. Sol Command, this is High Marshal Threnek Dahl of the Threxian Empire. We are entering your system's outer boundary for resource assessment. You have not responded to 17 prior contact attempts. Continued silence will be interpreted as non-objection. Silence answered him. The same silence that had answered every attempt for 41 years. Threnek smiled, satisfied, and turned to give the order to begin deployment. That was when the old buoy near Pluto, a small, forgotten piece of hardware that Threxian sensors had logged decades ago and dismissed as dead, non-functional debris, flickered to life for the first time in living memory. It had no weapons. It had no shielding. It was barely larger than a shuttle pod, and every scan the fleet had ever run on it said it was inert, harmless, abandoned. It was not abandoned. Its transmitter activated, locked onto the flagship's open channel and broadcast a single word across every screen in the Threxian fleet, spoken in flawless, unaccented Threxian, in a voice that sounded almost gentle. Wait. Then the buoy went dark again, and on the bridge of the flagship, 40,000 crew members waited to see what High Marshal Threnak Dahl would do next. 6 billion kilometers away, in a bunker built into the bones of a mountain that no satellite had ever mapped correctly, Admiral Mireille Okoye watched the same word appear on her own screen and allowed herself exactly one breath of relief. Buoy 7 confirms activation, said the technician beside her. Threxian fleet has stopped. They're holding position at the boundary marker. Good, Okoye said. Get me Wren. Dr. Elias Wren was 71 years old and had not slept properly in longer than that. He arrived in the command room still buttoning his coat, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, carrying the particular tiredness of a man who has spent his whole life preparing for a day he hoped would never come. They stopped at the marker, Okoye told him. Buoy 7 did its job. For now, Wren said. He looked at the tactical display, at the cluster of alien warships hanging just beyond the edge of Sol's outer boundary, close enough to see, far enough to still pretend this was a choice. That word buys us hours, Mireille, not days. It's bought us 41 years so far. It bought the last one 41 years. This one's different. He's not curious. He's confident. Wren tapped the display, where a small annotation flagged the flagship's registered commander. High Marshal. Career military. 3 campaigns of forced annexation on his record. Men like that don't stop because a buoy says wait. They stop because they're deciding whether it's worth the trouble of finding out why. Then we make sure it's not worth it. Ren didn't answer right away. He was looking past the display toward the far wall of the command room, where a long line of names had been etched into the stone. Not decorated, not memorialized with anything grander than plain lettering, because that was how humanity had chosen to remember them. He had helped choose that wall. He had put 6 names on it himself. "Bring in Voss," he said finally. "If this goes further than a warning shot, she'll want to already be moving before we finish giving the order." Captain Adais Voss was 34 years old, born 19 years after Seoul went silent, and had spent her entire adult life training for a war she had never been allowed to explain to anyone outside a very short list of cleared officers. She walked into the command room already half into her flight harness, dark eyes sharp with the particular restlessness of someone who has run the same simulation 400 times and was tired of it staying a simulation. "Tell me this is real," she said. "It's real," Okoye said. "Threxian fleet, 17 capital ships holding at the boundary. High Marshal Threnak Dahl commanding." "Then why are we still just watching them?" "Because that's the plan, Captain. It's always been the plan." "The plan was built for the last threat," Voss said, and there was an edge in her voice that had been sharpening for years. "We don't even know if it still applies. Maybe this one's different. Maybe this one actually wants to talk." "Maybe," Ren said quietly, "but we don't bet 41 years of discipline on maybe." "Not yet." Voss didn't argue further, but the look she gave him said the conversation wasn't finished, only postponed, the way most things were postponed in a command structure built entirely around patience. Nobody younger than 50 fully understood anymore. Aboard the Threxian flagship, Vesa stood at the edge of the command deck and watched Threnak stare at the space where the message had come from, jaw tight. "Sensor sweep," he ordered. "Full spectrum. I want to know exactly what that buoy is and who built it." The answer came back frustratingly thin. 40-year-old hardware, human manufactured, no active weapon systems, no power source larger than what would run a household appliance. By every measurable standard, it was nothing. And yet it had transmitted in perfect Threxian, on an encrypted fleet channel that no civilian technology should have been able to touch. "It's a bluff," Threnak said, mostly to himself. "An old recording, triggered by our approach. Theater." "Sir," Vesa said carefully, "theater doesn't crack fleet encryption." He shot her a look that told her exactly how welcome her opinion was, but he didn't dismiss the point either. Instead, he turned to his tactical officer. "Status of the resource survey teams." "Standing by, sir, awaiting your order to deploy toward the outer belt." "Binky." Threnak considered it a moment longer, weighing pride against the small, cold thread of doubt that had been growing since a dead cadet's report and a supposedly harmless buoy had both, in their own way, told him to be careful. Pride won, as it usually did with men like him. "Deploy the survey teams, and send 1 destroyer forward, the Ashkarel. A demonstration. Nothing lethal. Strike an empty rock in the asteroid field, close enough to Earth's monitoring range that they understand exactly what kind of force they're dealing with. Let's see if the silence holds after that." Vesa felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Sir, if they've been silent on purpose for 41 years, an unprovoked demonstration strike might be exactly the wrong. That will be all, Cadet." She held her tongue because there was nothing else to do, and watched the Ashkarel peel off from the main formation and accelerate toward a barren, uninhabited asteroid drifting in the debris field. A target chosen specifically because it was nothing, because striking it would prove a point without costing anything. On Earth, the strike registered on every sensor array humanity had quietly built into the edges of its own system, over 4 decades of patient, silent preparation. Okoye watched the destroyer's weapon charge on the display, her expression unreadable. Ren's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the edge of the console. Voss, watching from beside them, finally understood, really understood, for the first time in her life, that this was no longer a simulation. The Ashkarel fired. The beam crossed the distance in less than a second, aimed true, More than powerful enough to vaporize the empty asteroid exactly as intended. It never arrived. Halfway across the gap, the beam simply stopped existing. Not deflected, not absorbed by anything visible, just gone, as if it had struck an invisible wall exactly where humanity's outer boundary had always, quietly, actually been. On the Threxian flagship, sensors screamed contradictory readings, unable to explain what had just happened to several megatons of directed energy, and then every screen on the Ashkarel, and a heartbeat later every screen across the entire Threxian fleet, flickered to a single new image. A plain black background, and in the center, a countdown timer, already ticking. It read, 09:59. Then, 09:58. Threnak stared at it, his certainty cracking for the first time since he had taken command of this fleet, and demanded, to no one and everyone, "What is this? What is counting down?" Nobody on the bridge had an answer. Vesa did, or thought she almost did, a cold, creeping suspicion crawling up from the redacted report she had read hours earlier, the 3 broken letters she still couldn't place, and the single word a 40-year-old buoy had chosen, out of everything it could have said to warn them with. Wait, it had told them. Nobody had. 10 minutes. That was all the timer gave them, and on the Threxian flagship, 10 minutes felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Threnak tried everything a proud man tries when the universe stops obeying him. He ordered the countdown jammed. It didn't move. He ordered it traced to its source. The signal seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, bounced through so many relay points across the outer system that his engineers gave up trying to follow it after the 4th minute. He ordered the fleet to retreat to a safer distance, then, in the same breath, countermanded the order, unwilling to let a species with no visible fleet make him look afraid in front of his own crew. "It's a trick," he said again, quieter this time, as if repeating it enough would make it true. "A recording. A projection. Nothing more." Vesa didn't answer him. She was watching the timer too, but her mind was elsewhere. 6 hours back, an old encrypted archive, 3 broken letters that refused to resolve into a name. Cal. She pulled the fragment up again on her personal display, hands steady even though nothing else about her was. On Earth, the command room beneath the mountain had gone very quiet. "Talk to me," Okoye said, not looking away from the display. "Status. Countdown's holding steady," the technician replied. "No change in the Threxian fleet's formation since the strike failed. They're posturing, not retreating." "Of course they are," Wren murmured. "Men like Threnak don't retreat from a clock. They retreat from proof." Voss stood with her arms crossed, watching the same numbers fall. And for the first time in years, some of the restlessness had gone out of her posture, replaced by something closer to dread. "What happens when it hits 0? Wren didn't answer immediately. It was Okoye who did, and her voice carried the particular calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment more times than she could count. "Depends on what they do between now and then. This isn't a weapon, Captain. It's a test." "A test of what?" "Of whether they're the kind of empire that backs away from the unknown," Wren said, "or the kind that charges straight into it because pride won't let them do anything else." He looked at the display, at the tiny cluster of ships still holding position at Sol's boundary. "We've run this exact scenario 412 times in simulation against every plausible empire profile we could build. Do you know how many of those simulations ended without a shot fired?" Voss shook her head. 390. The ones that turned violent all had one thing in common: a commander who couldn't stand the idea of being tested by something he considered beneath him. Wren's eyes didn't leave the screen. "We're about to find out which kind of man Threnak Dahl is." Vesa found the answer to her 3 broken letters at minute 6. It wasn't in the sealed archive. That door had stayed locked no matter how she tried it. It was in a place she hadn't thought to check. The personal effects log of the envoy, whose name had been redacted from the original contact report, filed decades ago in an entirely different, unrelated database that nobody had bothered to purge because nobody had thought anyone would ever connect it back. A single line, buried among mundane inventory records, Returned effects of envoy Calvorn Cethus. Deceased. Cause classified. Calvorn, not a fragment of a species name. A person's family name. And a species designation neither Vesa nor anyone she knew had ever heard used in the Empire's current records, as if it had been deliberately, thoroughly erased from every registry that mattered. She didn't have time to chase it further because at that exact moment the countdown hit 0. Nothing exploded. No beam of light. No wave of destruction. Instead, every screen across the Threxian fleet, bridge displays, personal terminals, even the small monitors in crew quarters, went dark for exactly 3 seconds, and then filled with a single recording. It was old. The image quality was rough, clearly decades removed from current technology. The kind of footage that had been preserved rather than recently produced. It showed the bridge of a warship, not human, not Threxian, some third design nobody on the flagship recognized, sleek and dark and unfamiliar. Alarms blared in the background. A voice, speaking in a language the ship's translator struggled to parse cleanly, was shouting orders that grew increasingly frantic. The recording had been damaged, corrupted in places, jumping and stuttering through what looked like the final minutes of a battle already lost. Then, for just a moment, the feed cleared enough to show a view screen within the recording. A view screen showing Earth, blue and small and utterly unshielded by any technology visible from orbit, exactly as it must have looked 41 years earlier. The frantic voice on the recording cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static, and then by a scream that ended too abruptly to have been anything but real. The recording stopped there. It did not explain who had made it or why or what had happened to the ship or the crew or the species that had once flown that unfamiliar dark vessel toward an unshielded, unarmed Earth. It simply ended and left every Threxian on the bridge staring at a blank screen in absolute silence. Threnak was the first to speak, and his voice, for the first time since Vesa had met him, did not sound entirely certain. What was that? Nobody answered. Vesa's hands had gone cold around the edge of her console. She was thinking about a redacted envoy named Calvorn Cethus, and a species designation erased from every record she had access to, and a report that had ended with 5 words instead of a full account. Recommend immediate and permanent silence. Whoever had made that recording had not been the Empire. They had been someone else. Someone who had come to Sol first. Someone who had believed exactly as Threnak believed now, that an unshielded, unarmed, silent little planet meant an easy conquest. And whatever had happened to them afterward, the Empire had scrubbed even the name of their species out of its own records, rather than let anyone learn the details. Threnak straightened, visibly forcing his composure back into place, and turned to his tactical officer with the particular stubbornness of a man who has just been frightened and refuses to admit it. Old footage, doctored, staged, or both. It proves nothing except that Earth has access to editing software and a flair for drama. Resume the survey deployment. I want eyes on that outer belt within the hour. Sir, Vesa said, and this time there was no diplomacy left in her voice, only urgency. With respect, I don't think that recording was staged. I think it's real. I think something came here before us, and I think it didn't come back. Threnak turned to look at her, and for one long, dangerous moment she thought he might actually listen. Instead, he smiled, thin, humorless, and entirely too certain. Then it's a good thing, Cadet, that we are not whatever came before us. He gave the order to resume deployment. Across the fleet, engines began to hum back to life, ships sliding back into formation, moving once again toward a small blue planet that had just shown them, without a single word of its own, exactly what it was capable of doing to those who underestimated it, and had chosen deliberately not to explain how. The moment the Threxian fleet moved again, every weapon system on every ship went dark at once, and this time, nothing Threnak's engineers tried could bring them back online. It happened without warning, without a countdown, without so much as a flicker of alarm before the shutdown was already complete. 1 second, the Ashcarol's cannons were charging for a second demonstration strike. The next, its entire weapons grid reported total failure, and so did every other ship in the fleet simultaneously. across 17 vessels that had no business sharing a single point of vulnerability. Sabotage, Threnak said immediately. Someone planted something in our systems before we arrived. Find it. His engineers searched for the better part of an hour and found nothing. No malicious code, no foreign hardware, no trace of intrusion anywhere in the fleet's architecture. The weapons simply would not fire, as if something outside the ships themselves had reached in and quietly closed a hand around every trigger at once. It was, Vesa thought, watching the reports come in one after another, exactly as unnerving as it was meant to be. Back beneath the mountain, Dr. Elias Wren allowed himself, for the first time in hours, something close to a smile. That's Phase 2, he told Okoye. Soft lockdown, system-wide, no casualties. We've never had to use it against a live target before, only in simulation. It worked, Okoye said. It worked because they don't know what they're dealing with. The moment they figure out how it works, it stops working. We bought time, Mireille. That's all this ever does. Buy time. He rubbed his eyes, the tiredness suddenly heavier on him than it had been all day. I keep thinking about the crew on that ship 41 years ago. How much time did they buy themselves in the end? Voss, standing nearby, had gone very still. You keep talking about them like you knew them. Wren didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost its usual measured calm. I did know some of them. Not the crew. The people on the ground, under them, when it happened. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Voss saw something raw behind the old man's composure. I was 7 years old the first time an alien ship came to Earth. It wasn't the Empire. It was called the Calvorn Dominion, and they didn't come to talk. They came because our own broadcast told them exactly how undefended we were, and they assumed that meant we'd be easy. You've never told me any of this, Voss said quietly, because you didn't need to carry it before. You do now. Wren pulled up an old file on the display. Degraded, decades old, restricted even within their own command structure. It showed images Voss had never been cleared to see. Burning coastlines, cities half swallowed by craters, a death toll scrolling past in numbers too large to fully comprehend. They didn't send a fleet first. They sent scouts to confirm we were as helpless as we looked. When they realized we weren't helpless, just unprepared, they didn't retreat. They escalated because retreating would have meant admitting a pre-space flight species had made them bleed. We won. Barely. At a cost I still don't have adequate words for even after 41 years of trying to find them. Voss looked at the numbers again, and something in her chest went very cold and very quiet. That's why we went silent. That's why we went silent, Wren agreed. Not because we were afraid of being seen. Because we learned, the hardest way a species can learn anything, that being underestimated by the wrong kind of empire is far more dangerous than being ignored by all of them. So we made a choice. We would never again let anyone outside this system know exactly what we were capable of. Not until we absolutely had to. We would prepare in silence for as long as it took, and if that day ever came again, we would make sure it went differently. And the Calvorn? Voss asked. What happened to them? Officially, their dominion collapsed a few years after the war. Internal power struggles, resource collapse, the kind of thing that happens to empires that overextend themselves chasing a conquest that costs more than it's worth. Wren's jaw tightened. Unofficially, I've never fully believed that. Empires like that don't just vanish. They scatter. They hide. They wait for someone else to finish what they started and take their revenge from the shadows when the moment is right. On the flagship, that exact possibility was about to stop being a theory. Threnak, humiliated by the failure of his weapons and increasingly desperate to salvage his authority in front of a crew that had started, quietly, to doubt him, made the decision that would define the rest of the engagement. He ordered a full bombardment of Earth's outer defense platforms. Not a demonstration this time, but a real strike, using kinetic weapons that required no active targeting systems, no energy weapons that could be mysteriously switched off. Just mass and velocity and the brutal ancient physics that no clever countermeasure could argue with. "Sir, that's an act of war against a species we have not formally engaged," Vesa said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her not to. "You'll be starting a conflict the Empire never authorized." "The Empire authorized annexation," Threnak snapped. "If they resist annexation with force, then the conflict is theirs, not mine. Load the kinetic platforms. Target their defense grid. Full spread." Vesa understood in that moment that nothing she said would change his mind, and that whatever came next would happen whether she approved of it or not. So she did the only thing left to her. She slipped away from the command deck, found an isolated terminal in an unmonitored maintenance corridor, and opened a channel on a frequency she had no authorization to use. The same frequency that Dead Boy near Pluto had transmitted on days ago, when it had told an entire fleet to wait. "This is Ambassador Cadet Vesa Ilkarin," she said, her voice unsteady but clear. "I don't know if anyone is receiving this. High Marshal Threnak Dahl is preparing an unauthorized kinetic strike against your defense grid. I believe it will happen within minutes. I don't know why I'm telling you this. I think you should know." For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, a reply came back. Not from Okoye, not from Ren, but from a voice that carried none of their careful restraint at all. "Received," Ada Voss said. "And appreciated. Now get somewhere safe, Cadet, because in about 90 seconds your fleet is going to learn exactly why we spent 41 years getting ready for a day like this." Aboard the flagship, the kinetic platforms fired, and along the length of every human ship holding silent, dark formation in the outer system, hulls that had shown nothing but blank, unremarkable plating for the entire encounter began, panel by panel, to peel back, revealing weapons systems no outside species had ever been permitted to see, arrays humming to life with a low, resonant power that made the Ashkarel's sensors scream in protest. Threnak stared at the readings, his confidence collapsing in real time as Ada Voss's voice cut across every open channel in the fleet, calm, cold, and absolutely certain. "Wrong move. The kinetic rounds never reached Earth's defense grid. They didn't need to. Something faster was already waiting for them. Human interceptor drones, small and fast and nearly invisible on Threxian sensors until the moment they activated, rose out of positions they had held silently for years and cut every incoming projectile out of the sky within the first 4 seconds of the exchange. Not one warhead got through. Not one. On the Threxian bridge, tactical officers stared at readouts that made no sense to them, watching a species with supposedly no coordinated defense grid intercept a full kinetic bombardment with the calm efficiency of a fleet that had done this exact thing 1,000 times before. Because they had. Just never against a real target. "Return fire," Threnak barked, but the order came out ragged, the first crack in a voice that had never before needed to sound uncertain. "All batteries, return fire now." Whatever weapons the Threxian fleet had left came online, and immediately met something they hadn't accounted for. Human ships, dark hulls now peeled open along carefully hidden weapon arrays, didn't fight like an Empire fleet expected an inferior species to fight. There was no wall of firepower, no brute overwhelming force. Instead, there was precision. Strikes aimed with surgical accuracy at propulsion systems, shield generators, weapons batteries, disabling ship after ship without destroying a single one of them outright. Aboard her flagship's tactical station, Vesa watched the battle unfold and felt something inside her fundamentally rearrange itself. This wasn't a desperate, panicked defense. It was rehearsed, practiced. A species that had spent 41 years quietly perfecting the exact, precise amount of force required to stop an attacker, without ever showing them everything it had. "Admiral," said a voice over the human command channel, tense but controlled. Threxian flagship still fully armed and unresponsive to disable strikes. "Orders?" Okoye's voice came back immediately, steady despite the chaos. "Hold the line. Disable, don't destroy. Voss, converge on the flagship, but I want a clean shutdown, not a kill. We are not the Calvorn." "Copy that," Voss said, though every instinct honed by years of simulation screamed at her to finish it decisively while she had the advantage. She swallowed the instinct because Okoye's restraint was the entire point of everything they'd built, and on the Threxian bridge, Thrinak watched his fleet fall apart around him. Not obliterated, but methodically, humiliatingly neutralized, ship after ship going dark and drifting, disabled but intact, crews alive but powerless. It was, in its own way, worse than destruction. Destruction, at least, would have looked like a fair fight. This looked like a species allowing them to survive out of choice, not necessity. "They're toying with us," he said, disbelieving. "No, sir," Vesa said quietly, watching the pattern of the engagement with growing understanding. "I don't think they are. I think this is restraint. I think they could be doing far worse to us right now, and they've decided not to." Thrinak rounded on her, and for the first time whatever authority had always separated a high marshal from a cadet seemed to crack entirely. "Then finish the fight the way it should be finished. Order full retaliatory fire against their home world. If we cannot win this engagement, we make certain the cost is unbearable for both sides." "That is an illegal order," Vesa said, her voice shaking but her spine straight. "You would be authorizing a strike against an inhabited planet with no formal declaration of war, no council sanction, and no proof of hostile intent beyond a defensive engagement that you provoked. I gave an order, Cadet, and I am refusing it." The silence on the bridge that followed was unlike any Vesa had experienced in her life. She expected to be arrested on the spot, dragged away, made an example of in front of a crew that had already begun, in the space of a single engagement, to lose faith in the man commanding them. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She opened a fleet-wide channel, not just to her own ship, but broadcast across every surviving Threxian vessel still capable of receiving transmissions, and played back, word for word, Thrinak's order for an unsanctioned planetary strike. "Every officer on this channel needs to hear what was just ordered," she said. "And every officer on this channel needs to decide, right now, whether they intend to follow it." Nobody moved to arrest her. Nobody moved to carry out the order either. In the terrible hanging silence that followed, Thrinak understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the moment it's too late to matter, that he had lost his own bridge. It was in that same silence that he made his last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreck of his authority, not through force, but through the one weapon he had left: information. "You want to know why Earth frightens me, Cadet?" he said, low and bitter, the mask of confidence finally gone. "It's not the weapons. It's not the discipline. It's because we didn't find this system on our own. We were given the coordinates, the threat assessment, the recommendation to move quickly before Earth could finish preparing whatever it's been preparing for 41 years. Someone wanted this annexation to happen. Someone wanted it to happen badly enough to feed the Empire everything we needed to justify it." "Who?" Vesa demanded. Thrinak's smile was thin, humorless, and utterly without triumph. "Does the name Calvorn mean anything to you, Cadet? Because it should. I've seen the sealed files. Everyone in high command has. The Dominion didn't collapse 41 years ago. It went quiet, exactly the way this planet did, and it's been waiting, patiently, for a proud, ambitious empire foolish enough to finish the job it started." The words landed on the bridge like a second attack, worse than the first, because this one couldn't be intercepted or disabled. Vesa felt the cold certainty of the redacted report settle fully into place at last. Recommend immediate and permanent silence. And understood finally exactly what it had been warning against. Not Earth. Never Earth. Before she could respond, before Thranak's own officers could decide what to do with a commander who had just confessed to being manipulated into an act of war, a new alert tore across every remaining sensor array in the fleet, Threxian and human alike. A fleet signature had appeared at the outer edge of the Sol system, smaller than the Threxian fleet, older in design, its ships built along lines no current registry recognized, except for the sealed, decades-buried files that a handful of people on both sides had only just begun to remember. The insignia on the lead vessel was a jagged circle, half corroded by time but unmistakable to anyone who had seen the corrupted fragment Vesa had found days earlier in an erased archive. The Calvorn Dominion had never gone away. It had only been waiting for exactly this moment. A wounded Threxian fleet, a human defense grid already stretched thin from battle, and a chance, 41 years in the making, to finish what it had started. Nobody on either side fired first because for a long, breathless moment, nobody could quite believe what they were looking at. The Calvorn ships drifted into formation with the slow, deliberate confidence of a predator that has waited a very long time for exactly this opportunity. A wounded Threxian fleet, a human defense grid already committed to battle, and no reason left to hide. Their lead vessel broadcast no greeting, no demand, no diplomatic opening at all. It simply began charging weapons, aimed not at the human fleet, and not at the Threxians either, but at both, indiscriminately, as if 41 years of patience had left it with nothing but the desire to finish what it started, regardless of who stood in the way. On the human command channel, Okoye's voice cut through the chaos with a calm that belied exactly how much this moment mattered. All ships identify target as Calvorn Dominion Remnant Fleet. This is the contingency we hoped we'd never need. Command authorizes full engagement. Full engagement, Voss repeated, and for the first time in her life, the word didn't feel like something she'd been waiting for. It felt heavier than that, real, in a way the countless simulations never had been. Copy, Admiral. On the Threxian flagship, Threnakdal stood in the wreckage of his own authority, watching the fleet that had haunted his empire's sealed files for 4 decades finally reveal itself, and understood, too late, exactly how thoroughly he had been used. Belay all previous orders, he said, and his voice for the first time since the engagement began carried something other than pride. All batteries, target the Calvorn fleet, coordinate with the human defense line if they'll have us. It was Vesa who opened the channel, because nobody else on the bridge quite knew how, or perhaps quite believed it would be answered. This is Ambassador Cadet Vesa Ilkorin, aboard the Threxian flagship. We are prepared to stand with you against the Calvorn. I know that's not enough after everything, but it's what we have to offer. The reply came from Ren, not Okoye, his voice quiet, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who had waited 41 years to hear an empire admit it had been wrong about something. Received, Cadet, we'll take it. Match your fleet to Captain Voss's formation. Try to keep up. What followed was not the desperate, chaotic battle Vesa had expected. It was something stranger. 2 fleets that had, an hour earlier, been trying to destroy each other, now flying in loose, improvised coordination against a third that wanted them both erased. The Calvorn ships fought with a brutal, uncomplicated aggression, hulls built for overwhelming force rather than precision, clearly expecting to shatter whatever remained of Earth's defenses and finish the annexation their long-ago scouts had failed to complete. They had not accounted for Ada Voss. She led the human line with a precision that surprised even Okoye, who had spent years teaching her the value of restraint and had never quite been certain the lesson had taken hold. It had. Every strike Voss ordered aimed to disable rather than destroy, targeting propulsion and weapon systems with the same surgical discipline the fleet had shown against the Threxians. Except now, threaded through every maneuver, there was something else. Not mercy exactly. Understanding. A recognition that the crews on those Calvorn ships had likely never chosen this war any more than she had, born into a Dominion's long, bitter grudge, the way she had been born into humanity's long, quiet vigilance. Multiple Calvorn vessels signaling surrender, her tactical officer reported, disbelief evident in his voice. They're not used to being given the option. Then let's give it to them, Voss said. Hold fire on anyone who powers down. We didn't come this far to become what we were preparing for. It was Ren's words, she realized only after saying them. Words he had repeated to her 100 times in training sessions she'd half listened to, impatient for action instead of philosophy. She understood them now in a way she never had before. The Calvorn commander's ship was the last to fall, disabled rather than destroyed. Its captain dragged out in restraints by a joint human-Threxian boarding party that would have been unthinkable a day earlier. Vesa watched it happen from the flagship's observation deck, standing beside a silent, diminished Threnak Dol, and felt the strange, vertiginous relief of a war that had somehow ended, without ending everything. The days that followed moved faster than the battle itself. Threnak was recalled to face a council inquiry into the unauthorized strike he'd ordered, his career by any measure finished, though what remained of his dignity was spared the details of exactly how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered by a cadet a third his age. Vesa was offered a formal position within the newly opened Sol embassy, the first true diplomatic post the Empire had ever extended to Earth as something other than a target for annexation. She accepted it without hesitation. Ren found her on the observation deck a few weeks later, watching Earth turn slowly beneath them, blue and quiet, and no longer entirely unguarded in the eyes of anyone watching. "You defected for us," he said, not quite a question. "I didn't defect," Vesa said. "I just stopped pretending I hadn't already changed sides the moment I understood what your silence actually meant." Ren nodded, and for a while neither of them said anything, content to watch the planet turn. It was Vesa who finally broke the quiet. "The Calvorn commander is in custody. Your council will get everything you need to close the file, finally, after 41 years. You could have destroyed his fleet. Voss could have ended it in minutes, and no one would have questioned the choice given what his people did to you the first time. Why didn't you?" Ren was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the small blue world below them, the one that had chosen 4 decades ago, to answer an atrocity not with vengeance, but with the harder, longer work of becoming something an atrocity couldn't touch again. "Because we didn't want to become the reason someone else goes silent for 40 years, he said finally. "We know exactly what that silence costs. We weren't going to hand it to anyone else, not even them." Below them, across the length of the human defense fleet, hulls that had opened to reveal weapons no outside species had ever been meant to see, began, one by one, to close again. Panels sliding back into place, ships returning to the same dark, unremarkable silhouettes they had worn for 41 quiet years. Not because the danger was gone forever, because humanity had never fought to be feared. It had fought, patiently and at terrible cost, simply to be left the choice of when to be seen at all. Vesa watched the fleet power down, ship by ship, and understood at last what she had first sensed months earlier, staring at a redacted report and calling it a mystery instead of what it truly was. Not weakness, and never had been. A species that had survived the worst thing that could happen to it and chosen, deliberately, patiently, to become strong enough that it would never have to prove that survival to anyone again, unless someday it truly had no other choice. Earth turned quietly below them, waiting as it always had and hoping as it always would that the choice would never come again.